All right, welcome everyone to today's webinar, Ditch the Pip. I am so pumped to have you here and to be spending an hour with us at Talent Realized talking about performance improvement plans. So in prep for this, I was doing a little digging on performance improvement plans. I was like, where did these things come from? And turns out, from what I could tell, PIPs started from the US government in 1978 in the Civil Service Reform Act. That's as earliest as I could figure out that where these came from. And so since 1978, performance improvement plans have been a thing, and they started in the government. It's crazy, and they haven't really changed since. Now, I don't know about you, but I've seen leadership change and adapt over the years. And so what might have worked in 1978 in the 80s probably won't work today. We know leadership today is about coaching, clarity, accountability, not paperwork and bureaucracy. And we know people don't thrive through threats and top-down management. They thrive through ownership and coaching. And yet, in my years as an HR executive, like I've seen them stay the same process, same forms over and over again. And it really doesn't even line up with our leadership philosophies at companies. But nobody has been really questioning this, and we just keep on doing the same thing. And so that's where, when I started talking with Michael over last year, I was so just refreshed with his perspective on it. He had built something and changed the way he had done PIPs in a way that aligned with my leadership, philosophy. And I saw, wow, like this could really drive performance without crushing morale. So today I'm excited to show that for you and get you to, one, get to know Michael and hear his story about his PIP really journey and what he's created, with the hopes that you will walk away from this with some new ideas and tools to then go implement something in your organization. So my name is Phil Goodman. I'm founder of Talent Realized. And if you're new to us, if I don't know you, or if you don't know Michael, let me give you a quick intro on us. So Talent Realized, so most small businesses, nonprofits, churches, they honestly don't need a full-time chief people officer. But man, what I hear time and time again is that they sure need that trusted advisor to help navigate those complex people challenges, build strong teams, find great people, and create workplaces where people can thrive. So that's really where we come in at Talent Realized. We provide that HR experience, that executive level HR leader fractionally. So we help leaders link that business strategy with their people strategy. We oftentimes are mentoring junior HR teams, and we're oftentimes the confidant for executives dealing with tough people decisions. I oftentimes hear from my clients, like, Phil, I don't know who I would have gone to without you on my team. If you don't have a chief people officer best friend, guess what, guys? You all do today. So I am that person. Michael's that person. The whole Talent Realized team is that person. We all need one of those best friends, just like a friend with a boat is a great friend to have. And I finally have one of those, which is awesome. Can't wait to go fishing in a month. We all need a chief people officer best friend, because you all know people issues are crazy in this day and age. And for businesses, it's one of the areas where you're taking the biggest hit. The wrong hire, disengaged team, lawsuits. It really drags down your performance and is keeping business owners up at night. So if you don't have the right HR leadership in place, you need someone to help guide and coach you, reach out. Let us know. We love to chat. So as we are building this, I'm building a team of really amazing fractional chief people officers. So we're in your corner. Schedule a virtual coffee today if you'd like to get to know us. I'd love to hear your story, where you're at, and see if we might be a good fit for you. But one of the amazing chief people officers on our bench is Michael. When he joined, I was literally blown away to get someone with his caliber a part of Talent Realized. He has led HR strategies at the highest levels, and he served as chief people officer for multiple organizations, Fortune 100 companies. He's advised leaders across, I think, almost every country, I would say, over 150 countries, but I don't know what the percentage, what total countries are there out there, but you've got the majority of them out there covered with HR experience. So when it comes to that HR people strategy, I don't know, I would venture to say there are very few people in the world with the depth of experience that he brings to the table. So Michael, before we dive in, why don't you just take a moment to introduce yourself to everyone here on the webinar?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Phil. And thank you for that very gracious introduction. Look, I've been running HR for about 25 years or so, but I didn't always do HR. I actually started my career doing things like I ran a catering company for concerts and films. I worked at a hotel as a banquet manager, right? I mean, that was my experience, was a full P&L jobs. And then after graduate school, I got recruited into HR at GE. And the one thing my father told me over time was, whatever you do, don't go into HR. That's a true statement. But I got in there. I got this job at GE in HR. I was on the HR leadership program, and I loved it. I could not believe I got paid to do this. I've absolutely enjoyed my career, and it's been I've been very blessed. It's taken me all over the world. I've, as you mentioned, I've worked for very large companies, brands you've all heard of, like GE and Pepsi and H&R Block and Microsoft. These are common brands, and there was a ton of challenges in those very, very large companies. I've also worked for smaller companies, startups, companies that I can't find the logo anymore because they don't exist. I work for smaller companies that became large companies like DocuSign, right? Helping run the HR function there for DocuSign during just massive growth. And what I'm doing today in the last several roles I've done have kind of started as a fractional chief people officer, and then they've hired me, and I've gone in there for a period of time to be the chief people officer. So I love working with organizations, whether they're large or small, because they all have similar issues. If you're a small startup, you have some of the same complexities that a large company does, but you don't have the resources to do it. So, look, I've been really blessed to do this HR work. Absolutely love it, and I look forward to continuing to work with customers and clients all over the world.
Mm. Now, Michael, how many PIPs do you think you've administered, been a part of over your career?
Well, it's a hard number to get to. I would think it's got to be in the four digits. It's got to be at least in the thousands. A smaller number is how many of them have been successful at
Mm,
actually improving performance. That's a very, very small number. But look, I've worked
yeah.
with a lot of them, and as you mentioned on the outset, and as we're going to talk about today, they're not generally seen as a very pleasant, positive experience, and nor do they typically improve performance.
Mm. Now, before we jump in, let's just, for some of the people that might not even be familiar with PIPs, there's some people that it's like, oh yeah, I've done hundreds of them. There's others that but may not have done any. Can you just take a quick moment to explain what PIPs are for those people that haven't experienced them before?
Yeah, so generally speaking, when you think about a PIP, what it often is a lack of performance creates a sense of urgency with a manager who finally at their wits ends gets to say, look, we have to do something formally. From a top-down perspective, they document it all. Here's all the ways that you're not performing, and they typically hand it to the employee to sign with a time period that says if it's not turned around, your performance does not meet these standards within this time period, you're terminated. So it's generally speaking a very top down perspective. And, it usually only happens under circumstances where that performance has languished for a period of time. And the manager is now at the point where they have to document, or somebody in HR says you have to document.
Mhm. Awesome. Now, if you have questions along the way too, if you're in the webinar, feel free to use the Q&A section there. You can ask questions, then at the end, we'll save time at the end to go through them. And then if I see any along the way too, that might be kind of timely, I'll throw those in as well. So thanks again for the intro for that and for PIPs. Hopefully that gives you a quick overview of what they are. Now, like we said, I've done probably hundreds of them as well, not as many close to where you've done. But most of us, when you look at social media or any, posts out there, PIPs come across very negatively. And so when I saw that, there was recently an HR or an article in Wall Street Journal,
Mhm.
and this was the headline: "The most hated way of firing someone is more popular than ever. It's the age of the PIP." And so this one got me and Michael talking. And this was really what started the conversation of Michael, like, we need to help fix this. And we need to take what you've been doing over your, last few years and do something different. And so, Michael, for you, when I sent this over to you, what was your initial impression?
Well, I mean, honestly, it was really demoralizing to see because think it was in about 20, maybe 17, 2018. I was tired of doing them the way they had been done and came up with a very different approach. And we were starting to see a lot of success with it. And I wrote an article on LinkedIn, which is still out there. You can go find it. If you're not connect with me on LinkedIn, please send me a connection. Happy to do that. And so I thought there's a much better way to do this. But it just, people stick with what they know. And this, if you read this article, if you haven't, look it up, read it. It's remarkable how bleak this article really is about how this is just a terrible way of going about terminating employees, and no one likes it, but it keeps accelerating because we're in a situation now where, as the world has gone more global, as we're seeing more economic pressures, there's more pressure than ever to have fewer numbers of employees be successful, right? Produce more with less. When you have that scenario, you inevitably end up with what do you do with the situations where that's not happening. And unfortunately, people have just used what they've been using, as you mentioned, since the late 70s and continue to use them. So it's really unfortunate.
Yeah. Maybe talk through some of the frustrations here.
Yeah. So, when would a PIP typically come about? And, if you go to talk to any manager, and I literally mean any manager, next time you walk into a restaurant or wherever, and if you see somebody who's a supervisor, you could ask them a question. How's your team doing? They all know who's doing well, who's not doing well, what's working and what's not. Generally speaking, pretty much anything can result in the kind of frustration where you need to get something changed, right? It's quality of work. You're constantly reminding people you're not getting results, or it could be frustration because you've had maybe a lot of coaching along the way, but it's just not landing and you're just not getting the results. And so this is important because remember that most PIPs generally start, the idea for the PIP generally comes in a relatively high emotional environment. So truly, when you think about what gives rise to a PIP in the first place, it's usually emotions. It's usually frustration. It's usually, okay, finally, whatever they just did, yesterday was the straw that broke the camel's back, and now I got to do something formal. And that's usually the process where a PIP starts.
Hmm. Thanks for sharing that. Now, uh, what for you, what was that then trigger of like, all right, how do we do something different here?
Yeah. So if you think about being a manager is difficult, right? I mean, I've managed people for, 25, almost 30 years. I've managed people in HR roles and non-HR roles. Managing people is complex, and you add in, cultural differences, you add in differences regarding maybe time zones in different countries and languages. It just gets more complex. So it's not an easy thing to do well. And I think most of us intuitively shy away from conflict. Most of us know that when we are going to sit down with an employee and we're going to have that discussion, and you've all, if you've been there, you know what I'm talking about. You literally have to kind of prepare yourself. Okay, today at a break in our one-on-one, I'm going to have to bring up that, look, your performance is not where it needs to be. And this is a difficult thing to do. Not a lot of people embrace this conflict. Now, oftentimes we will say, well, I don't want to make the other person feel bad. But usually it's because we don't want to feel uncomfortable. We know we're going to get a reaction. Occasionally you'll sit down and say, hey, your performance is not where it needs to be. And someone will say, oh, I didn't realize, my bad. And you have a really good conversation. That's generally the exception. Usually, when people are presented with information, because performance is inherently personal, it's very hard for people to separate my performance with who I am as a person, my value as a person. So the challenge with PIPs begins with this avoidance of conflict, with this sense of, I don't want to have this conversation because I don't know the response I'm going to get. And I take all the pressure myself that I have to do everything and I have to write it out. And this is really where I started to realize as I was working through with managers for years and years, countless numbers of these PIPs, what I started to see a pattern that emerged. And one of those patterns was challenging to address because I would go to managers and say, what role are you playing in your employees' lack of performance? What role are you playing? And oftentimes you go, what are you talking about? Like, I'm not doing it. It's all their fault. And, I'm just responsible for telling them what to do. And so I think this gave rise to this concept that there are two very different roles here. Your job as a manager versus your job as an employee. And those are different things. And so this mistruth that we saw over the years is, hey, as a manager, if I'm going to go write a PIP, I have to write the whole thing, top down. I have to write exactly what they're not doing. I have to write exactly what they need to do. I have to write the whole thing. And these, if you've written these things, they're not easy to write. It's not a fun experience. Sometimes you actually don't know why you're not getting the performance. And so you could, as you're writing that PIP out, saying, here's what I'm seeing, you could be wrong. But generally speaking, that's a very top-down process where you take all the responsibility on yourself. Now, in reality, Phil, there are two players here. There's two people involved. There's a manager's role and there's an employee's role. And if you think about, they are not the same. They're different levels of responsibility. And let's talk first about the manager. So as a manager, your responsibilities are actually relatively simple. Your job is to define what's expected. Your job is to define what's expected, maybe how to do the role, maybe especially the context for why that needs to be done a particular way, for the outcomes you need to see. That's really your job as a manager, is to define that. And, if you've been in a situation where you've managed a lot of people, or you're a parent with children, it's very similar in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
What you recognize very quickly is you don't have control over what those people do. You just don't. You don't control how they think, how they feel, how they operate. And what you do control, though, is the environment around them that clarifies expectations, boundaries. In short, if you go to the next slide, if you look at what your number one job is, what does success look like? Here's what I expect in this job, in this role. And it could be a number of things, right? It could be multiple things, but here's what I expect in this role. And identify it. Success looks like this. Then what you'd say is, here's the gap that I'm seeing between what I expect and what I'm currently seeing as an outcome. And it's very important to recognize that gap. Oftentimes PIPs don't even address 1 and 3 on this list. Oftentimes PIPs are only, here are the gaps and what happens if you don't do them. Mm-hmm. It's important to take the time and define what success looks like, because oftentimes there's a gap in expectations. There's a misunderstanding between those parties of what is actually expected, or maybe what that success looks like. Third, to make sure that you explain the impact. And I've dealt with this one a lot. Let's say, for example, I take a very simple thing, like you need to be here at 8 a.m. and you're constantly showing up at 8:15. What's the impact of that? Well, when you get here at 8:15, the calls have started, or we've opened up the doors for the store, or whatever it may be. At 8 o'clock, it's causing this impact. Now, if you can't articulate what the impact is, then you have to ask yourself, am I enforcing performance, or am I just enforcing an expectation that's unrelated to performance? And so it's important to look at those kinds of things. And then lastly, you have to define what happens if performance doesn't improve. So I think the manager responsibilities piece with a typical PIP, usually 1 in 3 are missed. And I think it's really important. And as I've asked managers to go through the process that I'm going to take you through today, 1 in 3 is where they've really struggled. And so if you think about, Phil, why do managers struggle? Now, I don't believe it's because out of negligence. I don't believe it's because they don't care about their employees. I think every manager I've worked with, or for the vast majority, have really been dedicated in wanting to be successful. But there's this thing, if you've not heard of it, called the curse of knowledge. And here's what happens with the curse of knowledge. With the curse of knowledge, you as the manager might know a lot about your organization, about the processes that you're responsible for. In a lot of cases, you're the manager because you were the best at doing one of the roles, and they promoted you to be the manager. What happens in the curse of knowledge is you forget what it's like to not know what you know. And therefore, it's never communicated. You make an assumption. Well, I just make an assumption that everybody obviously knows that you should do this, or everybody obviously knows this. And I think if you're a manager listening to this today, the first thing you have to look at when there's a gap in performance, the first thing you have to do is look in the mirror and say, is there any kind of curse of knowledge going on here? And maybe even ask yourself the question. I assume they know what to do, they know how to do it, and they know why to do it. I make that assumption. How can I prove that? And maybe have a conversation with somebody and say, ask some questions if you see performance not improving well. Because when we're not aware of the curse of knowledge, we will simply have expectations on employees without actually addressing those things. And really, when you think about lack of performance, it's a gap between an expectation and an outcome. So this is really important to go look at. And the longer you've been a manager, the longer you've been doing what you've been doing. Look, I'm as guilty of this as anyone. Trust me. I go and work with teams and, look, I've seen 100 different versions of this. I've done this in large companies, small companies. To me, it's like common knowledge. And I have to catch myself and say, wait a minute, I got to break this down and make sure that I'm on the same page with the people on my team and the people who I expect to deliver it. Because this curse of knowledge does play a large role in a lack of performance. And so let's go then talk about what the employee's responsibility is. So
yeah, I think this is really where I feel like it deviates. Like you said, a lot of what you've talked about with the manager, a lot of that's responsible. Sometimes the HR team writing those things, but a lot of that has been in traditional PIP. So for those that aren't familiar, this is really where I've seen it deviate for Michael and a new process for what the employee's responsibility is in this.
Right. So typically what happens is in a normal PIP, and if you've received one of these, you know what this feels like. And if you've delivered one, you really know what it feels like, and it's not good. Usually you hand somebody something in writing. Now you might say, well, you get to respond to it, but you really don't. It's already completed. Usually there's just a place for you to sign as an employee. In other words, what's communicated to you is I already know the answer. I already know, and I've already made the assumption that your lack of performance is based almost entirely on your own efforts and your own, work ethic or, your own behavior. But that's not always the case. And so where this really deviates is we stop the manager right at define what success looks like, define the gap, and define why it's important. Stop. Then hand that to the employee. And typically it works something like this. You'll sit down with an employee and you'll say, look, we got some gaps in performance that we really need to get addressed. And here I've kind of identified, as I see it, what success looks like and why it's important and maybe where some of the current gaps are. And then you let the employee write the plan of what they're going to do differently. Now, what's amazing if you do this is what you get back. The first time I did this, I got back because I tested this on myself. I didn't just say to the leaders and managers in my organization. I did it first with a person on my own team, and I tried this. And I did it with 2 employees. The first employee I got back was a great plan. It was like, oh, yeah, that's awesome. Just do those things. And now my job was super easy. I just hold them accountable to what they said they do. The other employee delivered a plan back to me, and it didn't make any sense. It was like, well, this isn't even related to what we're doing. And I'm like, wow, we got a big disconnect here. But if you think about documentation, and if you think about a process to engage your employees collaboratively, then you have to give the employee the accountability and responsibility themselves to write, what am I going to do differently to achieve a different outcome? And and I think there's a great illustration that I've seen, and I want to give credit to the person that came up with this. The first time I saw this, and I think I saw this maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I was like, wow, that's it. That's what I've been trying to explain all these years. So I don't know who Liz is, but props to Liz. This is a fantastic illustration of this. Normal pips are what you see on top. Normal pips are an adversarial relationship between you and the employee. They're delivered as an adversarial relationship. They're delivered with consequences that are sharp and to the point. But in reality, the bottom is what you're trying to accomplish. In reality, you and your employee, me and my employee, myself and my manager, we're on the same team. What we're trying to accomplish is over here. It's whatever the problem is, and replace the problem with the gap. And that's what we're trying to illustrate as a PIP. So how do you create that environment? How do you create an environment where the two of you are collaborating to actually produce an outcome? And this illustrates it better than anything I'd ever seen. And the reason I believe, when you go look at the research and you go, and if you've experienced PIPs and you realize that for the most part, most employees who go through a PIP simply get terminated, and it's a way to document it. By the time the manager has gotten to the point of delivering the PIP in the first place, you have this adversarial relationship. And, that's not conducive to performance improvement. Even more importantly, what it does is sends a message to everybody else on the team. Because I don't care if you've got, let's say you've got 10 direct reports or 6 direct reports. If you've got a performance issue with one of them, how you treat that person, the others are watching. They're always watching you. And you might make the assumption that, hey, well, this person's a great performer. They're not going to see the way I treated this person, and it's having anything to do with them. And I would tell you, more often than not, you're wrong. More often than not, people will watch very closely about how other people are treated. And so this approach, once we started to implement it, we started to see remarkable results. And we started to see a different approach to it. Because one of the first questions I would ask, Phil, is, before we even started the process, as a manager, what do you want to see the outcome? Do you want the employee terminated, or do you want the employees to be successful? And if I heard, I just want the employee terminated, then we had a very different conversation about how to do that. If you want the employee to be successful, which for the most part, I'm assuming you would, you've already hired the person, you've invested in them, unless there's some serious code of conduct issues or other things, we ought to want our people to be successful. Then the standard PIP process does not produce that, but this certainly can. And so that's really the model. Now, if you think about this process as a manager, you might be thinking, hey, don't I give up some control here? If I write down my expectations and the gaps, and I let the employee write their plan, what if they come back and what if they say, well, it's not my fault I can't do this work, it's your fault, or I'm dependent on another department to produce information and they're not doing it, or other types of excuses. And so it may take a couple iterations, but your job as a manager is to listen. Your job as a manager is to be open to why performance is not happening. And if an employee comes back with, hey, I believe these are some of the mitigating factors and why I'm not achieving this outcome, as a manager, I want to know that. Because the number one jobs I have as a manager is to remove barriers for my people so they can be successful. So listen to what comes back. And it may take a couple of iterations, but then you'll end up with a plan that both parties agree on. And then you just go execute it. And now your job as a manager actually becomes pretty easy because your job is to support them in producing that outcome, to give them coaching and feedback. Now, I've had people in this process say, well, doesn't this feel like I'm somehow excusing poor performance? Absolutely not. This process in no way lowers accountability or lowers expectations. In fact, if anything, it raises them because what is immovable are this is what's expected and what success looks like. That's immovable. What we're trying to get at is how do we get there? How do we involve both parties in producing that outcome? And so this is not in any way, shape, or form something that lowers standards or lets employees off the hook. In fact, just the opposite. And when it's done this way, it can be done actually earlier on in the process before you get so frustrated that, it's the final straw and, then you give them, 30 days, 90 days, whatever, and you're terminated. This process can work much more effectively.
Now, Michael, one thing I don't see on this process is
Mhm.
a timeline. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. Yeah. So, timelines are a funny thing. Okay. So, first of all, they're risky. And look, if you've not been in HR for very long, and if you're working if you're working in an environment where your employees are covered by union contracts, et cetera, you have a whole bunch of very specific processes that you have to follow, right? Progressive discipline, et cetera. So you can take the concepts of this absolutely and apply them, but you're going to follow that process. If you're not in that process, right, you're under, in the United States in particular, you're in employment at will. Now, if you put on, and I learned this, by the way, the hard way. I learned a lot of my lessons the hard way. I didn't roll out of bed with a bunch of knowledge. I learned when things didn't work. So what I learned the hard way was I had put someone on a 90-day PIP. And the manager was very frustrated. And, I think it was like 3 weeks into it, said, I'm not seeing the outcome. And we terminated the employee. The employee filed a lawsuit against the company. Now, for wrongful termination, the way that it was ruled was that we had a right to terminate the employee for sure, but because we had put, in the way that it was written, we had put a 90-day window on it, we actually had to pay the employee for the 90 days. So there is some risk, if they're really poorly written, that it might create an implied contract for a period of time. But that's less of an issue. The main issue is this one. And if you've been a manager for a while and you've actually put somebody on a PIP and you've seen their performance improve, you've probably gone through what I'm about to tell you, which is you get this burst of performance in that window, and then that thing is over. And then they go back to right where they were, and then you have to start the process over again. And some employees are actually pretty good at, you see it with attendance issues, you see it with, a number of other issues where, look, they study those rules, they understand exactly when something's going to drop off and then how much time they have before they can get another one. This is different. I recommend to not put any time limits on these at all. In fact, the most common answer from employees who have come back and said, how long do I have to be on this? Has been, I'm not sure you're understanding what we're trying to do here. This is not about improving performance for a short burst of time. This is meeting the minimum expectations of this role. So how long you need to be doing these things, achieving the performance that's required, working and fulfilling the plan you came up with, I suppose is about as long as you want to get paid to do this job. So in other words, you're not looking for bursts of performance. What you're looking for is creating the sort of minimum standards for someone to get paid to do that role. So it's a very different way to think about this process. And it does take some getting used to. I have seen situations, I've seen this applied many, many times. I'd say probably a couple of hundred of these I've actually seen in action this way. And, you get the predictable outcomes, and we can talk about some of those. So I would say these are about a third, a third, a third. About a third of the time, the person comes up with the plan and they just don't do it, right? I mean, for whatever reason, maybe they just aren't motivated to do it. Maybe it's just not the right job for them. Maybe it's a bad hire. They don't have the right kind of skill set, et cetera. So there are times when you put someone on a plan, they come up with the plan to deliver it, and they just don't deliver it, and you end up terminating, right? About a third of the time, though, when a person is asked to write their own plan, they just self-select out. Because this is a cognitive dissonance thing for people. If you get handed a PIP, you're like, look, I'm not performing because I think this manager is biased, or I think the system's unfair, or whatever. And now they just proved it by handing me this PIP. And so I will just hang here as long as I can before I get terminated. But if I have to myself, let's say I've already checked out, I don't really like this job, I'm just kind of mailing it in until I can find another one. But I have to write my own plan and produce it. A lot of people at that time say, look, kind of the gig's up here, and I it's probably best that I just go. And actually that's a fine outcome, right? Because if a person doesn't want to be in the role, doesn't want to produce in the role for whatever reason, so choosing on their own to leave is fine. It allows you the opportunity to hire somebody else. Now, about a third of the time, and this is way higher than what I've seen with traditional PIPs, I've seen performance turnaround in amazing ways. In fact, I'll tell you one quick story. I won't tell you the company I was working at, but I had a manager come to me, and this company, it was crazy, right? We were growing like crazy. I had managers all over the world. I mean, super busy. So I had a manager come to me wanting to terminate an employee, and I took her through this process. And so, after a couple iterations, I said, okay, this makes sense. As a third party, I kind of understand what success looks like in the gaps, and, have the employee complete it. She came back to me a couple of days later and says, yep, we got a plan. I agreed to the plan. I think we're going to monitor it. And I was like, great. I got a million other things to do. I didn't think about it. I figured, well, if it doesn't work, I'm going to hear about it at some point and we'll deal with it then. So it was about maybe not only like maybe a quarter later, it wasn't that long, like 3-4 months later, I get an email from this manager wanting to promote somebody on her team and asking me sort of how to do that. And, asking for salary information for the next level, et cetera. And so I looked down and I'm like, wait, I recognize that name. So I call her back and I said, hey, isn't this the same guy that we put on a PIP like, 3-4 months ago? And she goes, yeah, he's killing it. Absolutely killing it. And I'm like, well, what do you attribute that to? And she said, look, to be honest with you, I think our training wasn't great. I think there were some missed expectation gaps. Once we got those aligned and we created that environment where we could talk to each other, he is absolutely nailing it. And not only that, but I've used sort of that same situation with him to be more proactive with the rest of the people on my team and communicate expectations more clearly. And the team is killing it. So I've actually seen it work really well. And, what's really important about it is having gone through all three of these scenarios, having terminated employees, having employees quit, having employees be very successful on it, I've not had one yet. Now, a lot of people come back, they don't like it, maybe they don't agree with it, but I've never had somebody come back and say it wasn't fair. They were given an opportunity. They were given an opportunity to come up with their own plan. They were given an opportunity to address issues and concerns they had. Both parties took that seriously. They were given a chance for success. And when you think about, this is something I've held to for a long time, and I've taken it into many, many companies that I've worked for. So if you're on this webinar and you've worked with me, what I'm about to tell you, it will be very familiar. To be successful as a manager, there's 3 things you have to do. Number 1 is your people have to have clear goals. Now, I've been able to prove this empirically in insanely large companies where we have tons of data. We could actually go to our employee surveys, look at a criterion like intent to stay, and say what best predicts that criterion. It was not what we thought. It was not compensation. It was not even recognition, or it was clear goals. Do your employees have clear goals? That's number one. Number two, do you have an environment of ongoing feedback? Do you have an environment where it's two-way feedback, where they get recognition if things are going well, they get feedback real time if they're not, they can, they can raise their hand, they can say, hey, wait a minute, I disagree with this. Number two, that environment, that feedback loop. And then number three is an environment that is created where people are treated with dignity and with respect and valued as people. One of the challenges as a manager, very important, is not all employees have the same value. Let me state that again. Not all employees have the same value. We promote some, we terminate others, we pay some more, some less. Every employee has the same value as a person. Everyone. Whether you're hanging by a thread from getting fired or you're the greatest employee you've ever seen, they have the same value as a human being. Creating an environment where people are treated with dignity and respect in a situation where there's no discrimination or harassment, etc. If you do those three things well, I'm going to repeat them. Number one, clear goals. Number two, feedback, ongoing feedback loop. And number three, a positive environment where your employees can do their best work. That's the air, food, and water being a manager. And if you can do those three things well, you are set up probably to the best of your ability to be successful. And this process, or a different approach to PIPs, is designed to work within that structure.
Now, can you share as well, because I know one of the outcomes that people use PIPs for is the compliance side and reducing risk, but can you speak to how these actually help organizations navigate that at a better capacity?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the, I guess, side effects of doing HR as long as I have is I have spent a lot of time in court. I have spent a lot of time dealing with EEOC charges, termination charges, you name it, right? I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. And the pattern that I've seen is that no one sues you. And suing is kind of the worst case scenario. But, nowadays people can go on Glassdoor and write terrible reviews. And, there's other means that they have to express their displeasure with your organization. And all of those are not good. No one sues you based on facts. They sue you based on emotion. To put it, I guess, rather crudely, they sue you because they feel like they were screwed over. And then they go find facts to fit that. But they sue you based on emotion. Think about a standard PIP process and the way it's generally delivered. It does not facilitate an environment where the person feels like they were treated fairly, generally. So your risk goes up. Yes, you've documented things. Sure. Yes, you've documented it. Your HR person might be happy because, here's my paper trail, or et cetera. And the person reluctantly signed, all the stuff that I wrote about them. But it doesn't address the emotional part of it. What you want to do is you want to prevent someone from suing you in the first place. The way you do that is you operate in a way that provides not only in reality, but the perception of fairness. You're not performing well. So let's both look at our roles. As a manager, I'm going to look at my role. Have I clearly defined what's expected, why it's important? Have I clearly understood and made sure that I've done that? As an employee, do you have a plan? Have we then removed any barriers? Have we come up with something we can agree on? That lowers your legal risk. Now, I will tell you, if you ever find yourself in a situation where you need documentation, the best documentation you will ever get in your entire career is someone's own words. I actually went into one case that we were trying to solve. We got sued and it turned into a EEOC thing, and they're hopelessly behind right now, like 2 years behind on their caseload. So they try to settle everything and et cetera. And we were able to produce, look, this is the person's, because they said they were wrongfully terminated. It wasn't performance. It was, something else. It was bias, discrimination, whatever. And we actually produced their plan. Here's where they wrote their performance gaps and what they were going to do differently. And then they just didn't do this. And that was one of the easier ones to deal with because you can never get better documentation than someone's own words, right? And so if you're trying to check the compliance box, this works better than a traditional PIP. It might
You,
take a little bit longer because you might need a little bit, a couple iterations there, but what it produces at the end is about as ironclad as it gets.
yeah. Can you just briefly explain the documentation part? What, like, how do you document these,
Right. Yeah.
and yeah, how does that differ?
So, it depends. A lot of organizations like templates, and you can create a template that's pretty simple, right? But basically the way I started is, you take a Word doc or Google Doc, whatever you're using in that regard. And as a manager, you're starting with the issues, right? So let's say issue number one is, a person, I don't know, take like an SDR, like somebody who has the dialing for dollars folks that are calling. Let's say you haven't met your targets, right? Your quota targets. So you would start with what the gaps are. You'd start with the expectation is that you will achieve 10 of these, you'll make X number of calls, et cetera. What we're currently seeing is this number, which is obviously a gap from what we expect. Why it's important is, our company depends on our ability to be able to sell to our products to new customers, et cetera. Then you have the employee, you literally hand them the document, the same document with a space, typically like you would do, like if you have a performance reviews where there's a self review and there's a manager review, there's generally a box for each person to sort of type things in. And you essentially hand it to them and say, okay, here's kind of where the gaps are. Why don't you take the next, 24, 48 hours and come up with what your plan is and what you're going to do differently so we can achieve the outcome. And so I can support you in that plan. And so we use, Word docs work fine. Google Docs work great because there's a sharing component to it. Or any other kind of forms or templates are fine as well. But it's less about the template you use and more about the process itself.
Yep.
All you really want at the end of the day is, as a manager, here's my section. As an employee, here's your plan. And then at the bottom, both people sign off on it. You're good to go. Could you do this just back and forth via email? Sure. I mean, you could do it really in any way you want. But generally speaking, a person being able to see and read and absorb, right? And understand, okay, there is a performance gap, and here's why it's important. Here's the clarity. And then to be able to write their own plan in that space related to it generally tends to work the best.
Now, when you told me this next thing, I was definitely intrigued as an HR professional, but you said not to put in the HR folder. Now, tell me your strategy on that.
So, so for me, I mean, you can document things, right? But look, what I'm trying to accomplish is I'm trying to help my employees be successful. As a manager of people who needs to achieve an outcome, who needs to hold people accountable to achieving that outcome, but also who wants to develop people. My first and really only focus is building that relationship, making sure there's clarity. And generally speaking, I keep it between myself and the employee. And you can get your HR person to sign off on it, or if you're an HR person, you can coach the manager through it, and you can see it. I generally don't put it anywhere near a personnel file unless I have to. Now, because my job is not to terminate them. My job is to help them improve. If you end up terminating them, then of course you take that documentation, you put it in their file because, at some point you may need it. But I wouldn't create it to be that formal from the outset, because again, it communicates to the employee, this is sort of, this is already a done deal.
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard to say, let me tell you everything you're doing wrong. Okay, now tell me your opinion about it. It's very hard to communicate that in a way that is collaborative. Remember that this PIP that we just described today is not really a completed PIP until both parties have participated in it. then it becomes the completed document, not something that's just handed to them and as if it's done. So, but everyone's different. If you feel like you need to put it in their personnel file, certainly you can. There's nothing wrong with that technically, legally or ethically. There's nothing wrong with that. But to me, it's not conducive to what you're trying to
Mm,
drive.
mm,
Are you trying to terminate an employee or are you trying to improve their performance? If you're trying to terminate an employee, that's pretty easy. I'll be honest with you. That's not a really hard thing to do, right? Again, it's employment at will. You can terminate anybody at any time for any reason. However, this process can hopefully give you a shot at improving performance and do it in a way that creates and doesn't, more than it needs to damage the culture and the people around them.
Well, thanks for sharing, Michael, all of that. For everyone in attendance here today, so we're going to be given a link later. We'll send you an email for those that have followed through. We put together a coaching plan, like a process template for your organization. And so feel free, it's a Google Doc. You can just make a copy of it and use it for you. But hopefully it goes over all the steps, gives you even manager tips and employee tips in there for each stage. Because sometimes for managers, it's challenging. You're getting feedback that points to you, and that can be like a moment of humility. So we go through that. We'll share this out. Hopefully, it's of value for you. And then as you go through it too, for everyone here, we're we're here. Like I said, we're your chief people officer best friend now. And so if you want to talk to us, you want to have a conversation with Michael and do a 1 hour strategy session, feel free. We want you to sign up, go to our website, book a time. We'll have a link in our follow-up email as well. And if you're like, how do I implement this in my own company? How do I implement this in my HR team or train our managers? We're happy to walk you through that and have a session with you and just see how you can administer it given where you're at. And then if you are looking at, wanting Michael or myself or anyone on the team to come in and help you design one out for your company, that's what we're here for as well. We can help you design it, we can implement it. And really what stands out is this should be a manager training. Like we should be training our managers so they know what the expectation is. And we can come in and do that. Michael can come in and talk to your managers. And that's what I like walked away with. Like, I want to have all my clients go through a workshop with all of our managers so they know, hey, this is the expectation. And if you hit a performance issue with your employees, this is the process. So our managers aren't surprised either. And what I am wondering what will happen is it'll probably lead to how are we developing our managers? How are we investing into our managers and giving them the development and coaching and expectations so they can thrive? So I think that's probably going to lead to those conversations, but we're here to help you. So now questions. If you have questions for Michael, now is your chance. Dive in. Questions, comments, we can go through. I'll read some of them that are coming through.
Yeah,
Some of them are just comments
I
too.
just answered one, Phil, which was,
Mhm.
a great question from Beth is, how often is there something going on with the employee, outside of work? And the answer is far too often. That's exactly the situation, especially if it's a shift or change in performance, right? If a person is shown that they can deliver and then all of a sudden they stop and they're struggling, oftentimes that's what's going on. And that's all the more reason to approach it like this and to approach it in a collaborative way and create the environment where your people can talk to you and tell you about things that are happening and you can help them navigate that. So yes, outside issues play a big role for sure. Now, again, there's always the tension between, you're getting paid to do a role. We need to produce this outcome, and that's a reality. But also, some understanding and some ability to partner with somebody and help them navigate through a difficult time and maintain their performance, is absolutely the right thing to do. And I think that it goes back to what I mentioned at the outset, which is, do you care about these individuals as people? Do you see that they're not just workers to produce an outcome? They're not just disposable people that you hire and then if they don't perform, you get rid of them. And creating those kinds of relationships allows people to be able to work with you where you can help them navigate how they might maintain their success on the job, in the midst of what are perhaps some difficult things personally. Absolutely. Comes up a lot.
Hmm.
Great question.
We have a few comments which were great. Thanks for sharing those comments. Another question from Lindsay just came in. What are the common mistakes managers make when they use this new performance improvement process for the first time?
Yeah. One of the mistakes that is made is something that typically you can catch, as the HR person. But one of the mistakes is shifting from here are the gaps to to making pointed statements about the person themselves. You're not doing this, you're not doing that language, as opposed to the expectation is X. What I'm currently seeing in terms of performance is Y. That creates the gap, and this is why the gap's important. And I think that's the biggest mistake is that you leapfrog that and go directly into sort of pointing fingers. What you want is the employee to recognize that that gap exists and themselves take accountability for closing it. Now, you could be right. You could be that's exactly why they're not performing. But you want to give them the chance to come back with a plan because they might surprise you and come back with a plan that addresses the very things that you think are the reason why they're not performing. In which case you're like, great, fantastic. I agree. Let's do those things. How can I help you? That's going to set you up for success. So again, that's the hardest thing is keeping it to a depiction of a gap as opposed to essentially maybe a condemnation of the individual and what you are observing. That's probably the hardest one because, and again, remember, oftentimes these happen in highly emotional situations. And what's our normal reaction when we're in a highly emotional situation? It's generally not to be quiet and listen. So I think that's a great question, and that's probably one of the more challenging things. And it just takes a little bit of time and practice to where you're really describing what the gap is only the first time and then seeing what you get back and whether or not it addresses that gap.
And oftentimes what comes to mind even when you were saying that is it triggers our brain. It's that amygdala hijack that new managers oftentimes do when they come in hot and they come in just, with those, those statements. And it triggers that amygdala hijack and our brains are literally just sitting there in the fight or flight mode. And then you have that conflict. And that's where it really starts escalating that you can see. And so this, I think, is an ability to avoid that really and to
Yeah.
have that higher cortex thinking. We're like, okay, here's that problem, like that illustration that you had the other day or earlier. Here's that illustration. Here's the problem. Now, how do we get there?
Yeah.
Um,
I see Chris has got a question too. How do you apply this
yes.
in the smaller orgs where the owner is highly involved in the business and there's a green HR team? Okay, so let me just say for the record here, this entire presentation is directed at managers of people. The whole thing. It's not directed at the HR function. It's unless people in HR sometimes manage people. It's directed at managers. So I think Chris, if you're in a situation where you're working with some smaller companies and they've got some performance challenges, share this with them directly and say, here's a productive way to address those. But this entire thing is really directed at managers. It's not directed at HR. What we're hoping is by dealing in the HR space, we're hoping we can kind of do a train the trainer sort of thing where HR people bring this into their organizations and can train their managers on how to do these a little bit more productively and do these in a way that has a better chance of producing performance improvement and creating the right kind of culture. So it's a great question, but it's directed directly to managers and in particular owners. If you want to talk about people with the curse of knowledge, go to a small company with an owner, right? There's
Mhm.
nobody on earth that has the curse of knowledge more than those folks because they know this thing inside out and backwards. It's their company, they built it, etc. And as they start growing and adding new people in, this becomes one of the first things to try to diagnose when there are performance gaps. Is that, do we have a curse of knowledge issue here? And the answer to that is almost universally yes.
Hmm.
So great question.
Appreciate that. Well, we're here at time. Thank you all for joining us at the first ever Talent Realized webinar. Thank you guys. We believe all of this stuff. We want you to have a thriving workplace where people are doing their best work more often. They're getting the feedback. They've got goals, and we're creating that environment that Michael was saying. So hopefully that was a value to you. And if anything, hopefully it's just stirring a new idea and thinking like, do I still implement PIPs as I have been? Hopefully it's a stirring innovation, and I would love to see what you guys are coming up with as well for PIPs and for managing performance. So thank you for all for joining. It's been a pleasure, and we will talk to you all later.
Thank you all.